Hello and welcome to the Fetal Position, episode number 2. Today we are going to be discussing a little bit about how to have productive discussions about abortion without making enemies. I posted on Facebook and Twitter that I was going to be talking about this, and I got a lot of really interesting feedback. The feedback I got on Twitter was really great. I don't really have too many followers just yet, but there was a lot of really good suggestions about what to include, some of which I had already planned on including, but there was also some other stuff that I hadn't thought of yet, and that I am including in this list because of that interaction. The same thing with Facebook. I think that a lot of people are really interested in this kind of topic, and I'm excited to dive on in. If you are interested in interacting on the subjects of the podcast, you can follow me on Twitter, which is at fetal_position. I'm actually just creating a Facebook group now. It's closed right now, so you need to my permission to enter pretty much, but you can go to thefetalposition.com/Facebook. I guess we'll see where we want to go with the Facebook group, because I would like for it to be a forum for good discussion, but I also know how Facebook can be when it broadcasts certain things to your news feed. You may not want to ask certain questions or be vulnerable in a certain way if you know that your pro-choice or even potentially pro-life friends will see that you're asking questions or something like that. So if you're interested in that, go to thefetalposition.com/Facebook. As somewhat of an aside, I noticed on the first episode that I was a little bit close to the microphone, because you could actually hear me breathing in every time that I would take another breath, or every time that as I was talking. So my goal here is to actually be considerably further from the microphone this time. Hopefully it actually helps. I've moved my pop filter a solid 7 inches further, and I'm sitting back from the microphone even another maybe 6 inches or so from the pop filter itself. So hopefully that helps. This might be me just being nitpicky about my own podcast, but I'm trying to hold myself to a certain standard, not only from the content side of things, but also from the quality of the sound as well. I have a couple other things. The first one I want to talk about is a book that I recently ordered off of Amazon. It's called Boarding Aristotle. It's by Dave Starrett. I'm probably about a third of the way through so far, and I was on Twitter, and a Twitter follower, Jerome Danner, decided that he wanted to get me in contact with Dave Starrett, which is the author of the book. I'm already friends with him on Facebook, but it was sort of like one of those things where I think he just accepts a lot of friend requests, and I'm following him on Twitter and stuff. But I appreciate Jerome, because he said that he was trying to connect me and Dave Starrett, and I asked Dave if he wanted to be coming on the podcast at some point, and he said that he would love to, and that we could schedule a date to do so. My goal is to finish Boarding Aristotle first, because it is one of the books that he's written. I'll toss a link in the show notes to the other things that he has written too, but Boarding Aristotle is so far very good. It's more along the philosophical lines. I want to ask him a few questions about metaphysics and things like that, so that should be a good podcast episode interview coming up soon. I'm not sure when that will be, but I'll keep you updated. And the last thing is that when I posted that I was going to be talking about this today, one of the suggestions was that I listen to the most recent episode of This American Life. Now, I don't usually listen to that podcast. I think I may have listened to maybe like the 5th episode or something, but the suggestion was really cool, because it turns out that it was talking a lot about how to be engaging in conversation, and how actually engaging in certain conversations can persuade people in the opposite direction of where they started. To make a long story short, I would suggest listening to the podcast, but there was a study that was done that showed that if you have a real life person actually talking to you about, in this case it was transgender issues, that the fact that the real life person exists and is talking to you about that it actually ends up changing the person's opinion from being either against transgender issues or something like that to being in favor of them. And it doesn't even have to be a transgender person that's talking to them about that. So the reason it's related to this podcast is because, talking about abortion with people is a complex issue. They actually made a mention of this in the podcast where they said that if, it showed that it worked for transgender issues, but they showed little to no change when it comes to the abortion issue. So my hope is to kind of change that in a way that will actually be able to have conversations work so that people ultimately change their mind on abortion. Well, not everybody, because I would like the pro-lifers to stay pro-life, although if they can be more consistently pro-life, that would be great. But the goal is to change, of course, pro-choicers' minds on this issue. What I don't want is I don't want it to be a game of pure emotional manipulation. That's sort of what it seemed like from This American Life, because it was all about having the conversation and getting to know a person who's involved in that situation, or putting a face to a cause. I recognize that is persuasive, rhetorically, or possibly, pragmatically, but my goal is not to manipulate, and I hope your goal isn't to manipulate either. But I want to focus on actually having real conversations with real people that lead to a productive dialogue on abortion. So this list that I've made is 6 tips that are kind of in different categories. They have been largely adapted from things I've read, things I've seen, suggestions made by other people, whether or not it's somebody active in the pro-life group or even potentially pro-choice people. But this is the stuff that I have found that actually leads to fairly productive discussions about abortion. And of course, we don't want to make enemies, and this is hopefully going to help you not make enemies, because that's not something we want. All right, so the first one is something I actually stole from Josh Brahm. He is the president of the Equal Rights Institute and a former host of the Life Report podcast. He was also very encouraging about the start of this podcast, and he even helped me resize the logo. So if you saw that it was wide, like a wide logo from the first episode, and now it's nice and square, you have Josh Brahm to thank for that. And I thank you, Josh Brahm. So side note, before I dive into it, Josh he was the former host of the Life Report podcast, and I've tweeted a few things out about this podcast, but it is fantastic. It's actually one of the main reasons that I've started this podcast was because he stopped making that one. It was a situation largely outside of his control, but the absence of his podcast kind of left a void in the podcasting world, at least as far as I was concerned. Now, since I've decided to launch this, I've noticed a whole bunch of other podcasts that are pro-lifely oriented, I suppose. But the fact that he stopped making these episodes inspired me to think I might be able to do that. So, that's why I have this. But so his former podcast, Life Report, has, I think it's 299 episodes. And they are fantastic. And if you haven't listened to them, go listen to. I'll just binge them because they are fantastic. I think I've listened to each one at least once, and many of them twice, 3 times. And he just has a great approach, and all the guests that he has on his show and the co-hosts, they're all just fantastic. So there's actually a video that I found while doing research for this that is Josh actually discussing how to have constructive pro-life discussions with people, and I'll put that in the show notes as well. All right, so now I'm actually going to dive into the discussion about the list of productive dialogue tips. The first one, like I said, I stole from Josh Brahm. His pro tip is to not be weird. And that might sound a little bit funny, but if you think about the types of conversations that you have with people who you just think, you're just being weird, you want to avoid that, because you don't want to put people off by having a weird demeanor, to put it simply. A couple of things that I've noticed that I would consider to be something weird would be to over-psychoanalyze people, where you're not really paying attention to their arguments per se, but you're just trying to negate what they're saying by assessing their motivations. I believe C.S. Lewis called this kind of approach bulverism, and it's not exactly an attractive feature of somebody when they're in a conversation. Also, another one, not being weird, is don't try to be overly sneaky about what you believe. You know, this isn't manipulation, like I said earlier. It's a conversation. And when you are being sneaky about what the point that you're trying to make, people feel like they're being manipulated. And I mean, think about all the conversations that you've had. Which ones have been the most productive? It's probably been the ones where you're not just waiting for your chance to respond. You're actually having a real conversation, listening to them, they're listening to you, and then you toss ideas back and forth. So I don't know, just there's something about being sneaky that bugs me. I don't know, maybe it's just me. The last one that I got was off of Twitter, and it was don't talk about souls. Now, on one hand, I, as a Christian, believe that we do have souls. However, there's a bit of a disconnect when you're talking to somebody who may not be as sympathetic to the Christian perspective of things. Because, there are plenty of pro-life atheists and plenty of pro-life agnostics and plenty of people who don't know where they stand on religion and don't know where they stand on the soul, but they are ready and willing to be able to be convinced about the right to life of the unborn. I have heard a bunch of people argue in the general vein that the reason that abortion is wrong is because, all human beings have souls. I think they're on the right track to talk about all human beings having a inherent right to life or a natural right to life that ought to be protected. But just to talk about souls brings up, I think, largely a red herring because, when does someone get a soul? Is it right at the very beginning? Is it, is it at quickening? The time when the mother can actually feel her baby moving? Now, we don't know the answer to this question. We can make some philosophical or theological kind of speculation, but if our goal is to keep the topic on topic, keep the conversation on topic, then we don't really want to go down the road of souls. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you've had discussions with people where you said, yeah, so, the soul begins at this time, and it actually has been productive. If that's the case, awesome. Let me know. The second tip is to have and maintain intellectual integrity. What I mean by that is that you should know your stuff, including knowing your opponent's stuff. But if you are genuinely stumped, don't be afraid to say, I don't know. Being willing to say, I don't know, provides you with pretty much a way out if you genuinely don't know the answer. And it's cool, too, because a while back when I first started getting into pro-life discussions and things like that, I would be deathly afraid of saying, I don't know. Someone would toss an analogy at me, this is, say the Burning Research Lab example. If you had to go into a burning research lab and you could save a whole cooler full of embryos and a single baby, which one would you save? And at that point I would say, the baby. I would save the baby, because if I'm being completely honest with myself, that's what I would save. I would save the baby. And they would say, see, haha, look at your whole pro-life case is down the drain because there's like 200 embryos here. And I would just change the subject. Now, that analogy is not, it's wrong on a handful of levels. I'll probably get into those analogies at some point in the future. Very quickly, the analogy is incorrect because that analogy is asking us, what would we save? Whereas abortion is asking us what we would kill. So right off the bat, the analogy falls apart. Plus, no, I'm not going to get into the rest of the issues about that, the problems with that. However, the point that I'm trying to make is that if you don't know the answer, I would save the baby. Haha, your pro-life case is wrong. Well, no, actually, I don't really know the answer to that particular question, but if you don't mind, I can, go do a little bit of research and I'll get back to you about it. What it does is it frees you up to continue the conversation and not feel like you've been defeated. Maybe you have been, but you don't want to just admit defeat right away. You don't want to stay in the conversation talking about that thing and then dodging the question and all this other stuff, because ultimately the goal is to have a productive conversation, right? On that same note, Knowing what you believe and having intellectual integrity provides you the opportunity to be abundantly clear about what you believe. It allows you to clarify what it is that you believe and possibly ask good questions that would require the other person to think about what they believe. Now, if you ask a good enough question and they also have the intellectual integrity to know when they don't know the answer to something, maybe you ask a question and they say, "Hey, man, that's a great question. I'm not sure. Maybe I'll get back to you on that." And what you've done there is you've allowed the conversation to continue beyond just this particular discussion and move on to something that you can have long term with this person. Point number 3 is to find common ground. Now, I've actually talked to a handful of people who think along the lines of, there's no way that I could ever find common ground with somebody who would deliberately murder their child. Okay, I get it. I get where you're going with that, but it's not an appropriate way to approach that topic because, you may agree with a lot about things. You may agree with them on a lot of things. For example, maybe they really care about women's rights. Show that you do too. I mean, assuming that you do. I mean, if you don't, you probably should. No, you definitely should. Show that you do care about women, their rights, things like that. Show that you do agree that an abortion is an emotional decision and it's very difficult to make. So like I said, it's not bad to agree on things and discover what you do agree on. And sometimes people don't even want to stop talking about that because they realize, oh, if I talk about this other thing, we disagree. But ultimately, if you just have a really good conversation with someone who disagrees with you, I wouldn't consider that a loss. Point number 4 is to listen to understand rather than just waiting for your chance to talk. Figure out who you're talking to, because a lot of times the person that you're talking to does not need an argument. They might just need to be listened to. But on the other hand, maybe they really do need an argument. Maybe they have a genuine question that is preventing them from embracing the pro-life viewpoint, and they're here to talk about it. And sometimes people just need to talk. You know what I mean? Like, so if you're interested in having a real discussion with people about things of importance, of course, including abortion, but it's not limited to abortion, just listen. Don't be that guy who didn't actually hear what the other person said because you're just waiting and you're already rebutting their argument in your head and already formulating your next one. Just chill out a little bit. You know what I mean? The next thing I want to talk about is sort of an overall way of living your life. It is treating the other person that you're in a discussion with like a valuable human being. If, as pro-lifers, we believe what we preach, that all human beings are valuable and have inherent natural rights and ought to be respected from conception to death, then we ought to show it. Now, I know technically being pro-life is a stance exclusively on abortion itself, but if we preach that we're treating all humans equally, we should show it. Now, sometimes that might mean to show that there's no inherent contradiction between being, say, pro-life and being in favor of the death penalty. But the key here is to make sure that the other person knows that we're not caring only about the baby before they're born, and then as soon as they're born, we no longer care. I know there are politics in that, and then certain people think there are certain political solutions to other things outside of, beyond when after somebody is born. But the key is to make sure that they know we don't just care about the unborn, that we care about all humans in general. And the last point I want to bring up, point number 6, is that we ought to be open-minded and have genuine humility. Keep in mind that it is possible for you to be wrong. Now just think, a year ago, you held a view probably that you don't agree with today, depending on on how much you've thought about things. So you have been wrong in the past, right? So while you may have thought about this a lot and done a lot of study on this, for me, I know where I stand, and I think that I have really good reasons to hold this position that I do on abortion. But I also recognize that I'm fallible. I'm not omniscient. The key here is to show that you are willing to change your mind. Now, changing your mind might depend on what exactly you are talking about and how much study you've done into it, but the most difficult thing to overcome is someone's perception that you are unwilling to change your mind. Because if they do that, then, okay, so if I find that I am interacting with someone who is just flat out unwilling to change their mind, I, frankly, I give up. I mean, maybe there might be some additional tactic that I could approach it with, but if I've talked to them for a long enough period of time and they are just unwilling, completely unwilling to change their mind, then I end up not talking to them anymore. Which this actually gets into the next point, or the bonus point, is to know your trolls. Now, I actually did a little bit of a discussion with Jeremy Lundmark on the Theology Mix Radio, and I'll put a link in the show notes about that. But there are certain attributes that people have that give them more troll-like demeanor, where they'd rather talk to you just to see you get, flustered and ticked off, instead of having a genuine discussion. My suggestion there is to not engage with those people for too long, because ultimately it's not really being productive. Unless, of course, maybe you are new to this. Maybe you're new to the discussion about abortion. You really haven't interacted with people in ways. Then, maybe you can use them for a training experience. However, I would suggest not engaging with the trolls for too long. Don't feed the trolls, as they say. At the end of the day, the goal of a conversation should be that both of you understand the issue better than you did before you began the conversation, even if that means that you may have to help him, your opponent, strengthen his argument before beating it to the ground, of course. There's been a lot of times where I will have had a discussion with someone and they have made the claim that the unborn is simply not human. Now, I think I said this in the first podcast, but when they say that it is not human, the unborn child is not human, they probably don't mean that. If they do, they just have a basic understanding of biology that's incorrect. They just don't understand that, a mommy and a daddy come together and they make a baby and it's a human. They don't understand that, or they're just ignoring it, or they haven't thought about it. But what the key here is to possibly strengthen their argument. It is a universally recognized fact that the unborn child is in fact human. If it has human parents, it is human. But what I have heard is that while it may be a human being, it may not be a person. You can possibly ask, is that what you mean? And they may say yes. And from that point, you can actually have a even better discussion, because of what we've talked about in the first episode and what we will be talking about in many, many episodes in the future about personhood. All right, so that wraps up my list of productive pro-life dialogue tips. Like I said, I will be putting all the relevant links in the show notes. It will be found on thefetalposition.com/2, because this is episode 2. If you have any additional pro-life tips or tricks, or even just dialogue tips that you've learned from discussing other issues, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter with a little @ fetal_position. And maybe I'll make an episode 2 or a part 2 for this one, because who even knows how many pro-life or dialogue tips there might be. There's definitely more than 6. So yeah, that ends this episode. One last thing, as I'm looking over to my left, I recently ordered a Defense of Abortion book by David Boonin. As I took a brief look through it, I've seen this book in a library before, and I read a little bit about it. But what I would kind of want to do, and let me know if you think this is a good idea, I want to go through the book, maybe chapter by chapter, maybe not chapter by chapter because there are long chapters, so maybe chapter segment by chapter segment, maybe not covering everything, maybe covering the whole book, who knows. I've never really thought about this, and this isn't even in my notes, but I would like to go through this book because I have heard that it's a very good book when it comes to the defense of abortion. I guess that's why he titled it that. So if you'd like to kind of do a book study, maybe we'll set something up and maybe do it via Twitter or via the private Facebook group. So if you're interested in doing that, let me know. And again, if you're interested in going and joining on the private Facebook group, which just pretty much has me in it at the moment, go to thefetalposition.com/Facebook. And before I continue just to ramble on and on some more, I'm going to go ahead and hit the music, and I will talk to you guys next time.